Hello BookTube. I thought I would release another video about the worst books of 2024 that I had the misfortune to read. I prefer to keep my videos positive generally, and therefore I rarely make videos like this talking about how much I disliked a book or certain books which I have read. But I think it's sensible and it's only reasonable to highlight some of the lowlights as well as highlights of my year reading. So this is going to be a video of the worst books I read in 2024, and I actually have a booklet with some notes here which I have made for my own reference, just to remind myself of certain details and to ensure that I speak about everything that I would like to discuss in this video. I have a horrible habit of forgetting to mention things, and I have given up my resistance to the idea of writing down at least some bullet points to give myself an idea of exactly what it is I would like to talk about. Now, I should caveat this video by saying that most of the books I am going to discuss are, first of all, books by a certain author, Charles Dickens, who I have a very difficult relationship with. Suffice to say, I have a serious love-hate relationship with Dickens, and I have been struggling a lot with this particular author. There are some works by him which I absolutely adore, and there are other works by him which I have had immense difficulty passing and enjoying. And I find his idiosyncrasies as a writer to be very, very difficult to grasp and to sympathize with, but also incredibly enjoyable when he does things right. So I'm going to discuss that particular author quite a bit in this video. Apologies to those of you who are Dickens fans. I am not a massive Dickens fan, but I respect Dickens and I have enjoyed some of his works in the past. I'm thinking of books like The Pickwick Papers and Nicholas Nickleby, both books which I highly enjoyed at the time that I read those books, and books which I hope to reread sometime soon. I should also say that I actually had the pleasure of reading Barnaby Rudge this year, last year I should say, which was actually one of the better books by Dickens that I have had the opportunity to read. So I think we should start with what was probably the worst book of my reading year of 2024, and that was Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. This is the fifth or sixth, I believe, novel that Dickens wrote. It comes immediately after Barnaby Rudge, which I greatly enjoyed, and is famous for being a retelling of the Gordon riots of 1780, told from the perspective of a variety of striking and interesting characters, and a large part of that book is actually given over to a reconstruction of the riots themselves, which does get a bit boring after a while because it's page after page of riots. But that was overall a very enjoyable read, and I actually think it's one of the more underrated books in the whole Dickens universe. Martin Chuzzlewit, on the other hand, is, I think, deservedly very low ranking when it comes to Dickens' works. In fact, I must confess that this is one of the only, perhaps the only book I actually DNF'd last year. And what happened is that I started reading this book, knowing about this book's reputation, knowing that it was a book which has divided opinion in the world of Dickens fans, and I was aware of its very low reputation among those who are familiar with Dickens' oeuvre. Nonetheless, I persevered, and I decided I would give this book a go. And after what must have been about 50 pages, I decided that I could not continue, and I gave up reading the book, which is a shame because I would have liked to finish the whole thing to have a more complete idea of what Dickens was trying to do in that book. Insofar as insofar as I can remember the details of that book, it is very much drawn from Dickens's time in America, a country which I also had the pleasure of visiting this summer, and it essentially revolves around this rather nasty group of characters, and all of them are portrayed as being money grubbing, as being rather unpleasant and rather self seeking. And this is supposed to be a satire, a social satire of the sort of thing that Dickens observed in his own society at this time. And it is meant to be also a satire of America, a country which he visited and strongly disliked, not least because a lot of American writers at that time were taking it upon themselves to illegally publish his work and exploit his labor, essentially, without, of course, giving him the dues that he deserved, the financial reimbursement that he deserved, because this is the era before we had strong copyright laws, and therefore he was very much at the mercy of these ruthless, unscrupulous American writers and newspaper people who essentially were passing off his work as their own creations. So that is one of the many reasons why he came to dislike America on his visit, and this is supposedly reflected in the book that he wrote, Martin Chuzzlewit, a book which I must confess I didn't even get to the part of the book where America is mentioned, because so disgusted was I with what I was reading that in the end I just had to put the book down and DNF it. And the problems I had with Martin Chuzzlewit were as follows. I felt that the characters in that book were introduced in so haphazard a fashion that it was impossible for me to really get a grip on who was who, or what purpose was being served by each character. No sooner would a character appear in the story than they would immediately be effaced by some other character who would appear in the scene and who would also do his bit and speak a load of nonsense before moving on and giving way to another character who would also speak a load of nonsense, move on, and you get the idea. And I simply found the pace at which Dickens was going to be far too dizzying for me to really get into the book. It didn't help that every single bit of dialogue was just completely inane. I couldn't make out what was being said, who was saying it, to whom they were saying it. I just found the whole thing to be a confusing mess, a morass, a jumble of whatever was coming out of Dickens's fevered imagination. And that was a big obstacle to my really getting into the book. I also felt that the prose was incredibly windy and overblown and over the top, even for Dickens, even by his capacious standards. I felt that the prose was far too much, and I felt that it was the work of a man resembled the work of a man who could have been on drugs when he was writing this. And actually, the correspondence which I have read by Dickens from this period in his writerly career bears what I'm saying out, because he is on record as having said to at least one person that he felt a rather strange fire burning within him that was compelling him to write this book. And I think he had a sense at that time of this book being a product, more or less, of his own resentments, frustrations, his own personal issues at that time. And this is something which is borne out by a lot of what I have read about what was happening in his life at this time. His career wasn't going as well. His His writerly career was at a stalemate, more or less. It was stagnating. His books weren't selling as well, and he saw this as a last-ditch effort to revive his career. And it clearly did not succeed because it was the lowest selling of all of the serialized novels that he had written up to this point. And reading it, you can see why it was the lowest selling of all of his novels. I did not enjoy it at all. I gave up on it after 50 pages, or more or less than 50 pages. I wanted to persevere and read the first 100 pages at least, but in the end it was too much for me, and I had to give up. Maybe one of these days I will come back to it, but to be honest, time is short, life is short, and there are many other books which I could be getting to. If you're wondering why I'm not showing you this book here, it's because I actually gave away all of those books that I am going to mention in this video, with the exception of Jude the Obscure, to charity. I gave up all of those books to charity because I don't want them clogging up my bookshelves if I'm not going to reread them anytime soon, especially if I didn't enjoy them. So you won't see any of those books here. That is something I wanted to mention just before I begin this video, with the exception of the one book I mentioned. Uh, that is the only book you will see out of all of these books. I will mention it in this video. Next we go to Bleak House. Now I feel very bad about including Bleak House in this section of worst books I read, because I know that so many people love Bleak House, and I know that so many people say it's his best novel, that it is Dickens' finest work, his masterpiece even, and it is an incredibly complex and layered piece of writing. I just couldn't bring myself to enjoy it, despite slugging through all 1,000 pages. It is his longest novel of all time. I just could not bring myself to enjoy it. I felt that the storylines were far too complicated. I felt that there were far too many characters to follow. I felt that it was devoid of Dickens's usual humor and sense of fun and playfulness. I found the endless digressions about the antiquated, inefficient legal system of Victorian England at that time to be incredibly boring and to be, frankly, very, very distracting because they just took away, I think, from the story. The most interesting part of the story for me was probably the story of Esther Summerson, who narrates a large part of the story. About, I would say, half of the story is narrated by her. The other half is narrated by an unnamed, omniscient narrator. But I found Esther Summerson and her adventures through this very complex and very dark world that Dickens portrays in the story to be incredibly interesting. And I wish we'd had more of that and less of the other stuff that was taking place in the story. I found the relationship between Esther Summerson and Mr. Jarndyce to be really interesting and to be really heartwarming as well. And I found especially thought-provoking uh, the way in which Mr. Jarndyce essentially gives up his claim on Esther's heart towards the end of the story. And of course, those of you who are into your feminism and who are into your critical theory will find this to be incredibly interesting as well, because it shows that despite his position of power, he is willing to set aside his own interests, to set aside his own desire for Esther when he sees that she is in love with another man. And I thought that that was very noble of him. I thought that the way in which Esther's traumatic experience with smallpox is portrayed in the story, and the way in which it essentially destroys her looks, is also portrayed very sensitively by Dickens, a man who was not, in fact, always very sensitive to females and to female characters in his novels. They are often portrayed very crudely. I feel like Esther is actually a somewhat layered individual, and I feel like she is actually somewhat human compared to many of the other creations in his oeuvre in terms of female characters. And I found the romance between Richard and Ada to also be rather interesting. And I thought it was a far cry from some of the other romances depicted in his novels, which are far too romanticized for my liking. I like the fact that this time there wasn't simply a cookie cutter happy ending, but that there was actually some tragedy embedded in that doomed relationship. So if the story had just been Esther Summerson, Mr. Jarndyce, Richard, and Ada, that would have been, in my opinion, a very good book. Unfortunately, the book also had to incorporate all of these other plot lines, uh, which I just was not interested in. I could care less about the Jarndyce versus Jarndyce court case. I just found that to be excruciatingly dull. I found the whole palaver over this endless legal case to be draining and to be very tough to follow. I did think that the whole drama of Lady Dedlock and her secret love child, and I won't tell you who that is. You'll find that out if you read the book. Was quite interesting, but again, there were just so many other plot lines interfering with the plot lines I actually cared about that it was difficult to enjoy. I should also mention that the book has a very slow beginning, ridiculously slow. It is about 400 pages or so before anything starts happening. And I just found that to be too slow for my liking. Maybe one of these days I will reread it. Maybe I will have more of an appreciation for it, having read it through once. Maybe I will have a better understanding, coming back to it a second time and being familiar with many of the characters already. It is not a terrible book by any means. It's just a book which didn't work for me. And I think that the fact that there were characters and plot lines I liked about the book shows that this is actually a work with some merit and that deserves some attention. But I found it to be, in the end, too long, too dry, and too difficult for my liking. I actually spent large parts of this book reading this on holiday in America and reading this in between flights and in the airport. I spent several hours reading this in Reykjavik Airport in Iceland, hoping to while away the time, reading some interesting literature. Unfortunately, Bleak House was not the kind of literature that was best designed to do this, and my experience reading it was indeed bleak. Next, we are going to go to David Copperfield, which is quite possibly the most overrated novel that Dickens ever wrote. The first half, I think, is brilliant. The first half is definitely up there in terms of the best stuff that Dickens ever wrote. I think the first half of the book that deals with the childhood of young David and his conflict with his vicious and cruel stepfather, the fact that his powerless mother is unable to defend him from this cruel treatment by his stepfather and by his stepsister-in-law, uh, step aunt, sorry. The sister-in-law is, of course, her sister-in-law, the mother's sister-in-law. I think the way in which this is portrayed is done very sensitively and in a very moving and very immersive way by Dickens. And I think the treatment of childhood and the treatment of his school years as well is also done superbly. And I just wish there had been more of that. The second half of the book is just incredibly dull. I had to force myself to finish the second half of the book. I just could not bring myself to enjoy it. I found the character of Dora to be, quite frankly, repellent and to be rather creepy as well. I found the whole relationship between herself and David to be bizarre. Maybe Dickens was trying to prove a point, by including this frankly childlike and absurd character into the story. I just did not enjoy that aspect of the story at all. And I found the latter half of the story to be deeply, deeply underwhelming and disappointing in just about every way. And if you read this book, you will learn very quickly that David is not actually meant to be the main character. There is that famous quote from David Copperfield about how, uh, I'm paraphrasing here, how it remains to be seen whether he will be the hero of his own life or simply the narrator of other people's lives and experiences. And you very much get a sense of that. The first half is very much young David. The second half is everyone else in David's life. And quite frankly, I did not find the older David, or indeed many of the things he was talking about, to be that interesting. My favourite character in the story was definitely Betsy Trotwood. I just think that she is an example, a rare example, I think, in Dickens, of a female character who is just done superbly. She is captivating, she is charismatic, she's actually somewhat complex as a character, and I just found her to be delightful. And I like the fact that, uh, contrary to some of his other stories, he doesn't make her a villain. I like the fact that she is meant to be a more positive character, as well as being a strong female character. So that was good to see. Um, but overall, David Copperfield, not one of the best things I read this 2024 of reading. Uh, Next, we go to Turgenev. I recently read a collection of short stories by Ivan Turgenev, the famous 19th century Russian writer. It's the first time I've actually read any Turgenev. I actually began this short story collection a couple of years ago, and I never finished it. So I thought that I had better finish it because it's a short collection, really. There's no excuse for not finishing it. I thought I'd go back to it and actually finish it, so I can decide whether I want to keep it on my shelf or not. So I finished it, and what can I say? It was a deeply underwhelming experience. The first story is perhaps one of his more famous short stories. It's called First Love. It's about a set of characters who are all gathered together in a room, talking about their experiences of falling in love for the first time. And the conversation is eventually taken over by this one character, whose name I forget, who narrates his experiences as a teenager of falling in love for the first time with a young aristocratic lady who moves in next door. And the story is all about his dalliances with her rather capricious treatment of him, and her other many male suitors, none of whom she actually commits to, all of whom she delights in tormenting. And it's fairly repetitive stuff, fairly nauseating, quite frankly, stuff, the sort of stuff you'd expect from a story about teenage love, more or less. And there is a rather bizarre twist towards the end where it turns out that she's actually having an affair with the protagonist's father, which is something of an interesting and bizarre, I should say, cuckold fantasy on the part of Turgenev there. I don't know whether that's something psychological on his part or not, but that was a very bizarre twist to the story. A story which, quite frankly, was, for the most part, rather dry and uninteresting. And that was probably the best short story in that collection, because the others are incredibly boring and repetitive and uninteresting, and I got nothing out of them whatsoever. They really aren't worth repeating. Very bare bones plots. Nothing really happens. I should say, as one good thing about these stories, that they are written very well. Turgenev is a masterful prose stylist, probably better than either Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, for that matter. And he was known for this. He was known as a very great stylist. I just don't care for any of the short stories in this collection. I by no means want to give up on Turgenev. I do want to read some of his other stuff. I still have to read Fathers and Sons, which is perhaps his most famous work, all about the relationship between one generation of Russian revolutionaries and another, younger generation of Russian revolutionaries. And I know that Dostoevsky's Demons, which I adore as a story, is actually meant to be a response to Fathers and Sons. So that will be my next Turgenev read. But this collection of short stories did not do it for me. Next, we go to Jude the Obscure, which is the only book in this worst books of 2024 list that I still have in my possession, that I have not given over to a charity store. Why did I not enjoy Jude the Obscure? Well, there were many reasons. Actually, I should caveat this by saying that actually I did enjoy Jude the Obscure to an extent. I didn't loathe the book at all. I did actually enjoy large parts of Jude the Obscure. I think rather than say I didn't enjoy it, I should say I was disappointed by it, because I know that so many people love Jude the Obscure. So many people say it's their favourite Hardy novel, and perhaps Hardy's best novel. And I wish I could agree. I wish I could say that this book is as good, or even better, than, for example, Tess of the D'Urbervilles or The Mayor of Casterbridge, which are my two favourites. And yet, I could not bring myself to enjoy this as much as I enjoyed those novels. And even in 2024, there were other novels by Hardy which I enjoyed more. I enjoyed Return of the Native, for example, a lot more than Jude the Obscure, I would say. In fact, I would say Return of the Native is the most enjoyable Hardy novel I read that year. Now, Jude the Obscure, as you all will be familiar with if you have read the novel already, or even heard of it, is that it's a story which revolves around the character of Jude, who, as a young man, is determined to become a scholar of religion and of classical languages, and is thwarted in this ambition because of his working class status, which means that he does not have the connections or the funds that will allow him to go to Christ Church, which is the story's equivalent of Oxford, and actually become a great scholar. So what he does instead, and this is very much drawn from Hardy's own experiences as a young man, he becomes a mason instead, much like the young Thomas Hardy had to become to earn a living. And he essentially plods along doing this rather menial work for many years, abandoning his ambition to become a great scholar, and allowing his life to be turned upside down by two very manipulative women who come into his life. And the names of these women are Arabella and Sue Brideshead. Now, Arabella is his first wife. She is a country girl who seduces him into marriage, who makes a false claim about being pregnant to essentially scare him into marrying her, but who then turns out to be less than ideal as a wife for Jude. And so they end up going their own separate ways. Sometime after that, Jude meets his cousin, Sue Brideshead, who proceeds to destroy his life in every way imaginable. And I found that this was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the story, which is that I was going into this with a very different idea of what this story would be about. I felt that this story would be first and foremost about Jude's ambition to become a great scholar. And actually what happens is that that aspect of the story dies away very early on. Very early into the story, Jude gives up on this ambition when he sees that it's not possible. and the rest of the story is dominated by his relationship with these two women who proceed to control and manipulate poor Jude in ways which are quite frankly degrading and make you feel incredibly sorry for him, but also incredibly frustrated by him. And throughout the story, I felt that Jude was essentially a puppet being used by Hardy to preach to the reader, to preach his own frustrations with Victorian morality and its hypocrisy, and to preach his own frustration with organized religion and with the institution of marriage in particular, something which Hardy had experience with due to his own very unhappy marriage to his wife. So I felt that the story that we got from this novel was different from what I was hoping it would be. It soon turned out that this was going to be all about Jude and the two women who destroy his life. And I found it to be incredibly frustrating as I was reading it, because it felt like in large parts of the book, a lot of the dialogue between Jude and Sue is nothing more than Hardy putting his own ideas into the mouths of these characters, who are simply puppets repeating his own thoughts. And that made it hard for me to enjoy the book as a work of fiction, because it was quite obvious that Hardy just wanted to bludgeon the audience with his own ideas, with his own agenda. Now, I did enjoy large parts of the book. I did actually enjoy the book on the whole, in general, but it wasn't the superb read which I was hoping it would be. It was an okay read. I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the narrative. I found what happened to Jude in the end to be rather tragic. And certainly what happens to Sue at the end is every bit as tragic. And the relationship between her and Mr. Phillotson is also deeply interesting and something you can look at from all sorts of angles, especially from a feminist lens, and what Hardy is trying to say about marriage and issues around consent and things of that kind. But overall, I would say that Jude the Obscure was a disappointing read for me, perhaps the most disappointing of all of the books I read in 2024. So that is what I would say for Jude the Obscure. I would say that in comparison with a character like Michael Henchard in The Mayor of Casterbridge, who is probably my favourite male character ever created by Hardy, Jude pales in comparison. The most impressive thing about him is that he's a self-taught linguist, but every other aspect of his character and his personality I just find to be lacking. I find him to be rather pathetic. I find the way in which he allows himself to be bullied and pulled around in all sorts of directions by the other characters to be nothing short of frustrating and infuriating. And I think his end is sad, but unfortunately all too predictable. So those are the worst books I read in 2024. This has gone on long enough, so I think I will end the video here. Please let me know what you think of my selections, whether you think I'm being fair or whether you think I'm being overly harsh in the judgments I've given of each of these books. And I look forward to hearing from you all in the comment section. Bye for now, BookTube.